Hey guys, how's it going? So I'm here to talk about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is a narrative poem translated by Marie Boroff, who is a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Yale University. She is a literary critic, a translator of, obviously, Gawain and the Green Knight, among other things. And she's published books on many different poets, on, I believe, Wallace Stevens. She's published a book of scholarship, I think, on the Gawain poet, the anonymous author of this work. Yeah, she's just a very well-known literary critic. I think she died a few years ago. But Gawain and the Green Knight, I wanted to do some kind of a chat about it. This is going to be just a little bit of background on it and my very general impressions. Nothing too crazy or in-depth, because this is just a first reading of a fascinating and complex narrative poem. So Gawain and the Green Knight is, as I said, a narrative poem. It was probably written around the 14th century by an anonymous author who is known primarily for the Green Knight, as well as a few other poems, which were all found as a part of the same manuscript together. And so they're all just assumed to be by the same poet. And they do share stylistic similarities that suggest they're by the same poet. The work of this poet wasn't really available until, like, the middle of the 1800s, 1839. This is when Wikipedia says the first is when Gawain and the Green Knight, at least, was published in its entirety. But it didn't really become well known until the 20th century, and has remained kind of inaccessible to the wider reading public because it's written in a dialect of Middle English. So the author of this poem was probably a contemporary of Chaucer, but his English is a lot less accessible than Chaucer's English. With Chaucer, you can put in a little bit of effort, and you really can get his language under your belt. But with the Gawain poet, really, it's so remote that you would really need to do an in-depth study of Old English to understand it. So a translation is quite necessary, and Marie Boroff has supplied a very nice translation. So Gawain and the Green Knight is an Arthurian romance, sort of in the tradition of many different authors from the Middle Ages. There were dozens of authors writing Arthurian romances in the Middle Ages. It was a very popular subject, as you might assume from how popular it still is today. But most notably there was Chrétien de Troyes, who wrote a big book called the Arthurian Romances, which was just a collection of tales surrounding King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. There were two anonymous Middle English poems, perhaps around a same time as the Gawain and the Green Knight, about both the death of King Arthur, the collapse of his realm after the revolt of Mordred, and also another poem about the adulterous love affair of Lancelot and Guinevere. And all this huge tradition kind of all culminated in Sir Thomas Malory's writing of Les Morts d'Arthur, his big fat collection of Arthurian legends, where he kind of synthesizes all these disparate tales that have been written throughout the Middle Ages into one big work. But this poem, this is just a very short poem. It's about 50 pages. It is written in an alliterative style of poetry. And this alliterative style, for anyone who doesn't know, alliteration is just where a verse in a poem will use the same first consonant of a word several times for a sort of sonic effect. So just as an example from the first line, this is the first line of Marie Boroff's translation. Since the siege and the assault was ceased at Troy. So you see the many S's in that verse. That alliterative poetry was very common in sort of Middle and Old English, not so much as English matured past Chaucer's time, but in Old and Middle English it was quite common because English was a Germanic language, and in Germanic languages the stress in words tends to be on the first syllable of a word, not universally, but it does tend to be. And that is sort of in contrast to Romance languages like Italian and French, where the emphasis tends to be on the last syllable. And because in Germanic languages the emphasis on the word was often the first syllable, it sort of makes sense that a poetry tradition developed around emphasis on the first sound of the words. In contrast, in a sense, to Italian poetry, where you have where the primary sonic effect used is rhyme. Each stanza of this poem is sort of as long as it needs to be, but it always ends in a little sort of tale that's kind of delightfully called a bobbin wheel, and it's sort of a brief sequence of 5 verses that are much shorter than the rest of the stanza, and that rhyme in A-B-A-B-A format. And the first line of the bobbin wheel will be much, much shorter than the other 4 lines. And just to give you a taste of Murray Boroff's translation, and to give you a look at this form that this poem is written in, I do want to read just one passage, and it was my favorite passage of the entire poem, and it's just beautiful. It doesn't really, this passage doesn't have any bearing on the events of the poem, and doesn't make reference to any of the events of the poem, so don't worry about sort of being lost because of not having context or something like that.
And then the season of summer with the soft winds, when zephyr sighs low over seeds and shoots. Glad is the green plant growing abroad, when the dew at dawn drops from the leaves, to get a gracious glance from the golden sun. But harvest with harsher winds follows hard after, warns him to ripen well ere winter comes, drives forth the dust in the droughty season, from the face of the fields to fly high in air. Wroth winds in the welkin wrestle with the sun, the leaves launch from the linden and light on the ground, and the grass turns to grey that once grew green. Then all ripens and rots that rose up at first, and so the year moves on in yesterday's many, and winter once more by the world's law draws nigh. And Michaelmas the moon hangs wintry pale in the sky. Sir Gawain girds him soon for travails yet to try.
So yeah, that just gives you a little taste of Murray Boroff's translation, and it's really a gorgeous translation. The language is just beautiful. Now, on to what this poem is actually about. I've managed to get this far into the video without mentioning that. As you might have guessed, it takes place at the height of the court of King Arthur. We open the story at a New Year's celebration, and all of King Arthur's court is together at Camelot. You hear mention of many of the famous heroes of the Arthurian legends. There's Lancelot and Guinevere, and obviously Arthur himself. But none of them play a huge part. Gawain is really the most important character here. And so everyone's making merry and feasting for the new year. And then all of a sudden, a knight dressed all in green marches into the hall, the Great Hall, on his horse, and issues a challenge to King Arthur's court, and says that any knight in King Arthur's court who would like can have his axe that he's brought in with him, if they will strike his head off with it, and agree to receive that same blow a year from that day, as a game, sort of. And so everyone's kind of shocked by this challenge, and there's sort of an awkward silence after he makes this challenge. No one's really coming forward to take up the challenge, and you get the sense actually that Arthur is a bit embarrassed at the cowardice of his knights. But anyway, Arthur gets kind of fed up with the silence in the room and finally just offers to take up the challenge himself. At which point Gawain heroically steps forward and decides to take up the challenge, and so he takes the axe and he chops off the knight's head, and everyone was kind of aghast at this offer, because you think you're gonna chop off the guy's head, he's gonna be dead, so what kind of offer is this? But no, the Green Knight just kind of casually picks his head up, and kind of holds it up, and it talks while he's headless, and he climbs back on his horse, and actually, the scene where the knight was holding up his own head to talk, I couldn't help but think of Dante's Inferno, because there's a famous scene in Dante's Inferno where someone in hell is headless, but holds up his own head, and it talks to Virgil and Dante, and I don't know if that's a direct allusion, but it's kind of an interesting parallel. But so yeah, the head then tells Gawain where he needs to meet him in a year to receive his just desserts for entering this challenge, and it's a place called the Green Chapel. So kind of a year passes, a melancholy year, because Gawain's kind of expecting to die at the end of it, when he will have his head chopped off. And finally, the new year after the last new year starts to approach, and Gawain decides to go forth and find the Green Chapel to keep true to his obligation. And he basically just asks around the countryside where this Green Chapel is, and no one really knows. But after asking around and sort of wandering around the countryside, he ends up in North Wales, as one does, I guess, and stumbled across this magnificent castle in North Wales. And he doesn't really know whose castle this is. He wasn't expecting to find it. But basically he approaches it and is welcomed into the castle once he tells them that he is Sir Gawain of King Arthur's, of the Knights of the Round Table. And the people at the castle are just delighted to have a Knight of the Round Table there. The Lord of the Castle offers to let him stay there. It's a few days before New Year's by this point. And the Lord of the Castle just tells Gawain that he knows where the Green Chapel is. He'll take him there when he needs to go there, but he should just stay there. And while Gawain is staying at the castle, he is tempted several times by the Lord's daughter, or at least who's sort of implied to be the Lord's daughter. It's not exactly explicitly stated that she's his daughter, but she's a young woman who's there at the castle who seems high status, so it would seem to make sense that she was his daughter. And Gawain is tempted by her several times romantically, and resists several times, but eventually does sort of give in a small way that I won't give away just because I don't want to go too in-depth on this summary, although I've already gone quite in-depth. But he does sort of give in to temptation when she offers him a trinket, in a sense, that he shouldn't have taken. Yeah, so anyway, that's as far as I'm going to go with summary, because this is a hugely complex poem. It actually combines three different traditional stories. We have the challenge of the beheading with the Green Knight, which is one traditional story. We have the temptation by the young lady, which is another traditional story. And then there's this other story that, there's this other traditional story that's sort of woven in to his time at the castle, where the king, or the lord of the castle, keeps offering, makes this offer to Gawain, telling him that he's gonna go hunting. The lord is gonna go hunting, and Gawain can stay at the castle. And everything that the Lord gets while hunting, Gawain can have, and anything that Gawain acquires while he's at the castle, he has to give to the Lord. And so this exchange of these things that these people have acquired throughout the day is another traditional story. The Gawain poet weaves them in seamlessly into one overarching story. And at the end of this poem, you definitely come out with this sense that Gawain, who is this exalted knight of Arthur's court, a knight of the Round Table, is not a perfect human. Because, as I said, he does give in to temptation in a small way, but he still does give in to it enough to be reprimanded in the end. He does come out alive. I will give that as a spoiler, to the extent that you can spoil something like this that's so old, and also not that long. And also, a book like this doesn't really rely on, some kind of last-minute twist. This isn't a plot-driven book, as many of these stories tend to be. But you come out of this story with the sense that Gawain is a flawed human, is fallible, and that sort of brings me to the part of this video where I just want to talk a little bit about my impressions. And there are two big themes that I think are very closely linked in this poem that I saw on my first reading. And the first is a sort of sense of cyclicality and circularity, which I think was sort of emphasized in the passage that I read, where you have the changing of the seasons and the inevitable changing of the seasons and inevitable sort of decay into winter, but winter will always be followed by summer, and etc., on and on ad infinitum. And you have passages like that, and you also have a really interesting thing. So there's this passage where the writer describes Gawain's shield and armor, And the major insignia on Gawain's shield and in different places on his armor is a pentangle, which for anyone who doesn't know is just when you make a star with 5 lines to make a star. And actually this poem is the first recorded use of the word pentangle. And what's really interesting about a pentangle is that when you draw a pentangle, you create a pentagon within which you can draw easily another pentangle. And you can draw another pentangle within that pentangle, and you can draw pentangles ad infinitum, in theory at least. So the pentangle is, throughout Middle Ages, is a symbol of infinity and circularity because of the number 5. And so this association of Gawain with circularity and infinity and with the seasons, and given his fallibility that we see, has a lot of wider implications for the Arthurian court in general, because if Gawain is fallible, the Arthurian court is fallible, of course. And of course, if you know anything about the Arthurian legends, the Arthurian court never ends well. And that has wider implications, furthermore, for all of humanity, because we are all fallible in this way. And this theme of circularity and infinity sort of suggests that all humans are, in a sense, doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past, essentially, of people like Gawain. And we're all, in a sense, sort of going to fail somehow, because we're all fallible human beings. Because if these exalted characters can be flawed in this way, then how much more we normal people. So, as you've all probably gathered by now, I found this poem very interesting. The Wikipedia page for this poem is nuts. It has like 20 subheadings. This poem, I take it from just that look at its Wikipedia page that it's been analyzed to death. And it's a short poem. It's like 50 pages long, but it is jam-packed with imagery and language and very complex language. And it just seems like it would lend itself to so many rereadings. And yeah, I think it's a book I'm definitely going to revisit. It's so complex, and yeah, anyway, I found it very interesting, and I'm really eager to hear if anyone who's watching has read this and knows more about it than I do, because I don't know much about it, and I don't pretend to. And I would love to hear anyone else's thoughts on it. And yeah, anyway, that is Gawain and the Green Knight. And anyway, I will see you all in my next video. Bye, guys.